Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Doomer Optimism. My name is Trace Crow, and I'll be your host today. Um,
Actually, Trace, that's not what's going to happen today. My name is Dave, and I'm actually going to be the host. Trace is somebody that's going to be very familiar to anybody that listens to Doomer Optimism podcast. Uh, Really, really wonderful guy who's doing a lot of really interesting things that he doesn't talk about a lot because he's always the guy doing the background work. And so today is the day to learn a little bit more about Trace because I think there's some really, really great things that Trace has got going on in his life that's slightly different than the vast majority of Doomer Optimism podcast guests. And I think it's really, really important to underline some of these things because there are, the vast majority of people that come on this podcast are like, go buy 20 acres and, graze some sheep and plant an orchard. Well, Trace has got a very different approach to how he's handling what, we all kind of feel and see is coming up in the future. And I want to dig into that. But before we get there, Trace, I want you to tell us about, you had a really formative train ride when you were 12
I
from
did.
Michigan to Colorado. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. I feel like I'm being interviewed by Oprah. This is a deep cut. Yeah. So when I was 12, my parents decided they saved up and we were going on this really cool Colorado ski trip. But instead of driving or flying, they decided to take an Amtrak, and this would have been 91, 92. Um, an Amtrak ride, like it's taking you through generally like either nowhere or kind of the seedier, like less invested in parts of towns. And
Flyover country.
yeah, it's a beautiful cross section of our country that you don't I mean, they call it flyover country for a reason, right? You don't get to see it from an airplane, and now with the highway system, you don't even get to see it from a highway. Like you really only get to see it by train or by bike, or by intentional drive. Um, and it happened to coincide with me like getting super interested in Simon and Garfunkel, which is like a moody
Okay.
introverted teenager. Like that's not or maybe that's the perfect music other than The Cure maybe. So I sat on this train for almost 2 days, maybe 36 hours. It was a sleeper car, and listened to Simon and Garfunkel, especially like America, right? Literally taking a bus across the country. Um, and seeing like this part of the country I'd never really seen before. It kind of like hidden out of view. I mean, you're 12, you don't travel that much. Um, it made me realize how beautiful this country is and how much there is to it, right? And that there's all these little niches and that it's all romantic and it's all interesting if you just um, you know, get down on the 10-foot level at the human level, right? Um, and at that very early age, I already was finding a lot of beauty in like the ruins of the 20th century. Certainly in growing up in the Rust Belt, like the ruins had already started, right? By the 90s in Michigan, all the industrial stock was falling apart. Everyone was out of jobs. It was a very like kind of bleak time period to grow up in and place to grow up in. But I already saw the beauty in all of it. I saw the opportunity, right? Because when you go to get to a certain point, the rules get suspended, which means when the rules are suspended, that means really good ideas, really emergent ideas, that's when they can come out, right? I think we're actually seeing it with Detroit and many of these Rust Belt cities is that they got so low that they're able to actually like be more flexible and do more interesting things from a more diverse viewpoints than places that are booming, like in Atlanta where I live now. It's booming, and so the feeling is to tighten, right, and be like, oh, we want to hold on to what we have. We want to keep growing and growing and growing. And when growth is like not even if that's your pipe dream, right, then you have this opportunity to like really rewrite the rules. And I won't say I glimpsed all that at 12, but the kernel of it was, the seed was
It
planted.
was there. Yeah.
Right? It really didn't take expression until I took in college. I took the history of suburbia. It was like one semester when I was 19, and it was like
Based on Kunstler book.
basically, yeah, and
Yeah.
also like the late 90s, early 2000s was like a renaissance of like black comedy around, American Beauty, right? Like, there's all these like really deep critiques of suburban America.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
which really was the fallout of like grunge movement and like this whole like, the Reagan era sheen that got over everything, and that was even made worse by Clinton, was all just that. It was just a veneer on something very, very rotten. And suburbia was kind of starting to be identified with that, and I knew in college, I knew a lot of kids from suburbia. I happened to grow up in a functioning small town in the Rust Belt, which is like, it was a unicorn. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a unicorn. I could ride my bike from one end to the other, like literally. When I was 11, I'd ride my bike with my friends. It was like Stranger Things. It literally was like freaking Stranger Things. We'd ride our bikes across town and we'd go to the drugstore and get candy and we'd get Mad magazines and
Like an unheard of amount of agency for an 11-year-old.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's because it just cars hadn't taken over. It was just not a very car centric place, which again, for Michigan is a very strange place to have grown up.
Yeah, no
Um,
kidding.
but I met all my friends were from suburbia, from car centric, 60s suburbia. And they hated it. Like they did not have a sense of place. Like still to
Mhm.
this day, Grand Haven, it's in my heart. It's home. It's what I think of as home. And they were all like, no, I got to get the hell out of here as quickly as possible. And
Mhm.
it's because the places are very unlovable. Like they're built for machines, not for people. Um, and the history of suburbia class, like, was what helped me articulate that. It's one problem of being outdoors. Can you hear the plane?
Again,
Yeah.
it's not too bad.
Um, yeah, and it articulated the problem for me, like, and yes, during that class, they uh made me read Geography of Nowhere by James Howard Kunstler, and it was like, it just cracked my head open. I was like,
Oh yeah.
this is putting a name to everything I intuit, right? Um, and from that moment, I was a new urbanist, like, or more to the point, a walkable urbanist. It was like, we have got to get rid of the cars. We have got to focus on the human scale. We are ruining our psychology. Like we're literally ripping the fabric of our society apart by forcing people to live in pods. It's funny that we talk about the pod people now, but suburbia is just pods. These are these little like residential pods, commercial pods.
Separated by roadways that you can
Yes,
only traverse in a car.
exactly.
A
And it's
pod separated by tubes that only pods can go in.
yes, it's deeply dysfunctional. And when someone finally kind of like pointed out, like, most people's lived experience is they like sit in front of the television, then they go in their garage, they get in their car, they drive to a place by themselves, then they sit in a cubicle, and then they get back in that car and then drive back. And almost at no point did they talk to another human being, right?
Hmm.
And if they did, it was mediated through capitalism, through their jobs, right? Through this kind of this false sense of or this sense of precarity, right, about your social scenario. And I think like seeing that so viscerally in Southeast Michigan, on the heels of what is almost like Mayberry, where I grew up, it just like was like, this like immediate jarring thing for me. And it just completely changed the trajectory of my life. I saw something, I like to say it's like those old 3D pictures, right? Where like once you see the 3D image, it's very hard to unsee it.
Oh
I
yeah, for
just
sure.
couldn't, it screwed me up. I've never, that was over 20 years ago, and I've never been
And
able to think the
yeah,
same.
you've been ruined ever since.
Yes,
Which
exactly.
is which I can imagine has a lot to do with what you're doing for a living now. There's this thing that I always strive for to increase in my life, this like alignment where you have dreams and values, and the thing you spend all day doing drives towards both those dreams and is in complete alignment with those values. And like I really, really admire people who can do that on all fronts. And it really seems like you've been doing that. Can you tell us about what you're doing and why it's, why you think it's important and how it relates to, your path there?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, kind of following the line, right?
Yeah.
Kunstler really changed the way I couldn't see urban design another way. I saw how dysfunctional it was, and I also got in a car accident right around the same time. I totaled the car, but I was actually like, I was fine, right? And no one was injured, but my car was totaled. And then that last bit of like boyish sense of like immortality was just stripped away. And now it's like, oh my gosh, I'm in a 4,000 pound piece of metal going 75 miles an hour next to other 4,000 pound pieces of metal. Like that sense of invincibility in a car has left and it's never come back. So I have this like very just bad relationship with cars. I hate cars. And so that was really like the lightning rod for me, right? Like it was like Kunstler told me why I should hate cars. I already hated them. And so that became like my rallying cry, right? Was just like, get rid of cars. I'm just get rid of the cars, go back to walking everywhere. I'll deal with the horse shit. That's fine. We can have horse shit in our streets as long as we don't have these freaking cars killing everybody. Um, but around 2012, 2010, 2011, before that, but I was starting to Occupy Wall Street is really what, again, kind of cracked the veneer for me. I was working in banking. I was working for a major international bank in the retail side. And I would spend all day defending, as an assistant manager, like defending the bullshit rules of this multinational corporation. And then I would spend all night on Twitter watching the Occupy Wall Street movement get their heads beat in by the cops. And I'm just like, oh my God,
You're like, I'm completely unaligned. I'm 100%
exactly,
unaligned.
exactly. And I said, I have to change this. I have to change it. And the change for me was that I said, well, I have to learn the rules of the game. And that's, I've been like, oh, well, I'll be an outsider. You know, I wanted to play music and be an artist and stuff. And that's a beautiful thing to do. But it wasn't a direct action enough for me. I thought, well, I have to learn the rules. So I went and got my MBA. And almost immediately out after that, I quit banking, got my MBA, and then almost immediately started working in like the startup space, you know, which immediately appealed to me, because it's just like, it's the Wild West. It's like the difference between a fraud and a success in the startup world is literally like how much money you make, like whether you're actually a success. And in many cases, look at Uber, right? Like what is the line? Like what is the real difference between Uber and Theranos, right? There's very little daylight between these two companies. And one is fraud and the other is, you know, oh, you made a bad investment, guys. Sorry you didn't see through the transparently bullshit veneer they put out there, right? But I love that precarity, that like Wild West nature of it, like just really appealed to me. And I've been working in startups ever since. So mostly on like, you know, kind of my sweet spot is taking like an early stage startup that has clearly a good founder, product market fit, a little bit of money, not much, and now are ready to like professionalize. Like we want a professional brand, we want a unified narrative, we want to know how to tell the story. Maybe they need some light sales help, that kind of stuff, right? And I've done it repeatedly. I started my own company. It actually ultimately failed, but I like to say it was my real MBA. That's where learned about business.
Your training ground, yeah.
Yeah. I learned so much from it, and then I just started helping other brands kind of get started. And then, like COVID, virtually everyone we talked to, COVID was a transformative experience. I literally like one night like heard like the mental noise that was always going on just sort of cleared, and it was like make food. I just heard this very clearly. I didn't hear it. It was in
were you like really hungry?
I wasn't. It was kind of late at night, and I was just kind of tired, and it was not as it wasn't like the angels came on high and, you know, came from on high and sang to me. It was my voice. It was the normal like voice in my head, but like it just was eerily clear, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
make food. And I'm just sort of like, you know, sitting there being like, what the hell is that supposed to mean? Like, how am I going to make food? I don't know what I'm doing at all. I've tried to grow peppers 5 years in a row and haven't gotten a single pepper. Like, what am I going to do? But the next day I started like emailing like kind of food related nonprofits, just seeing if any of them needed a volunteer. And none responded except for Jamie at Rootstown. And he wrote me back and was like, basically like, I don't need a volunteer, but I could really use a marketing guy right now. And so we kind of struck up this deal that I would help with some branding and web work. And like, I mean, it was like,
how long ago was this?
This is October 2020. And
Okay.
it
So
was like like the business equivalent of love at first sight. Like we knew immediately that there was something between the two of us and that we could help each other make something cool. And and so I started with Rootstown full time by like January, February of 2021, like within a
what is
couple of months.
what is Rootstown?
Yeah, so we're an educational platform, so we're helping transform the landscaping industry. Right now, it's like one of the most dangerous, most ecologically destructive industries in the country. But it is a $130 billion industry every year. So there's lots and lots of resources available in this industry, and it's doing about as badly as it could ecologically. So it's like even a little bit of change would be a huge change, right? Um, and so we're,
Wait, before can you give us a couple of bullet points under how badly normal landscaping is doing?
yeah, I mean, well, it's a major driver of particulates in the air, right? So it's causing asthma, it's causing hearing loss. And these are just the people who work for landscaping
Yeah.
companies, right?
So
Um,
we're talking about like leaf blowers and
Leaf
lawn
blowers,
mowers,
yeah, yeah,
the noise and the dust that gets kicked up by all of this largely unnecessary make work
yeah.
in order to like
And they're
exert a certain amount of
using
control.
Yeah, exactly. And they're using two-stroke engines, which are the most like dirty engines you can really use. Because it's not just shooting off like the CO2, which we're all familiar with. It's also got a bunch of carbon monoxide, which is way worse than CO2. And it's throwing off like particulates, right? Like the fine matter that like essentially would poison the food. If you're trying to grow food, you'd have to really wash it off because it's kind of poisoning the ground. It's kind of poisoning everything around us.
So we lived in a when we lived in the Bay Area, we lived in the Bay Area for close to 2 years, and when we lived there, we lived in this on this cul-de-sac. It looked like a quiet little cul-de-sac, walking distance to the school, kind of the best case scenario for a suburb. We had a little spot for a garden that we started. We walked our kids to school and back. We didn't have to drive much at all, but I was absolutely not prepared for the Saturday and Sunday morning marathon of leaf blowers, lawn mowers, and weed whackers.
Mm-hmm.
It would start at 7, and we couldn't, it would be the most beautiful day outside. And we couldn't keep our windows open or our doors open
Mm-hmm.
because it was so incredibly loud for hours straight, because they would just go from one house to another. And then there'd be another crew that came in. And it absolutely blew my mind that this was like normal in suburbia, because I grew up in a suburb also that wasn't like this. This has become extremely normal, especially in more affluent suburbs where it's just constant noise on the weekends. It's absolutely insane, and I never really thought about the particulates, except that it smelled bad too. So I
Yeah.
guess I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very real thing.
Yeah. And yeah, and beyond that, like the way they're maintaining it, right? The over pruning, I mean, we don't think of, we think that a bush is supposed to be a round, nice, beautiful shape, geometric
Or
shape.
shaped like a box so that it
Yes.
doesn't
Yeah.
impinge on a sidewalk and it looks like you have absolute control. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But what we're cutting the tree, right? Now losing branches and self pruning and stuff like that are something that trees and shrubs, bushes do naturally, right? But the level, just the intensity of it is diseasing them. It lowers their lifetime by years, right? So you end up essentially the way we're maintaining. If we really want to boil it down, it's enormously costly from an ecological standpoint. Soil runoff, herbicide and pesticides getting in the water, right? All that kind of stuff. But it's also just costly. We've convinced ourselves that it's the most cost efficient way to do it, except for we have to turn over the landscapes every 5 to 6 years because we're beating them to death. Or what usually happens, especially with public landscapes, right, is they never replace them, or they replace it 15 years later. And by the time they replace it, we have like these little stubby sticks, right? Um,
Mm.
there's actually a really drastic example at one of the libraries that we've worked at in DeKalb County here in Georgia, where they had a really beautiful plan like just 6 years ago. And you kind of see pictures. It's like the worst kind of before and after, right? It's like, this is
Oh
what it looked
no.
like when they put it in. This is what it looks like after 6 years of mow and blow, right? And maybe it would be forgiven if it actually wasn't expensive, but like you look at it and say, okay, well, the county spent probably tens of thousands of dollars destroying the landscape they spent tens of thousands of dollars installing, right? Um, and so if you just kind of take the whole package, it's really astounding that the landscaping industry has gotten away with it for this long, that it's been this destructive and this costly. I mean, it's virtually unchanged since the 50s. You know,
Oh yeah.
all that's happened is there's just more of it, and it's more destructive and more brute force, right? Um, and so, you know, our whole vision is that you can not spend more, right? Not do more, just do different. So, what if landscapers were growers, right? What if they were there to help grow spaces and they had some basic horticultural knowledge? You suddenly now have a semi-professional career that someone can do that is not giving them asthma. It's not, you know, occasionally chopping someone's toe off. It's not, ruining their hearing and poisoning rivers. And it's like they're there to steward the land in what we call productive urban spaces, productive urban landscapes. And so that's the vision, right? That's the vision is we want to take that 130 billion we're spending, which by the way, everyone says we have no money for climate change, right? Or climate mitigation, yet we've spent $1 trillion in the last 10 years making climate change worse, actively making it worse. So what if we just take that budget, right, and slowly shift it? Let's start with wildflowers. Let's start with some fruit trees. Let's start with some basic stuff. Let's start turning our leaf blowers off when we're not
But
using them, you
but
know?
Trace, I heard that urban fruit trees just drop fruit and it attracts flies and then becomes a nuisance. Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah, and that is not untrue, right? But the thing is that many of our urban spaces, what's so fascinating about them is that when you plant the right species of fruit trees, and fruit-bearing shrubs and plants, what you get is the right kind of insects and birds who then, even if humans don't eat it, the birds eat it, right? And the insects eat it. And but that's also our vision for this is kind of twofold. One is that here in Georgia, we already have an amazing organization called Concrete Jungle, which has mapped out all the public fruit trees. And then they send their volunteers being like, oh, this is fig season. Go check this batch of fig trees out. And then
that's
they give all
cool?
that food they disperse it to food kitchens and food pantries and things. So that model, right? Just have volunteers. But our vision is we're already paying millions of dollars in many cases for landscaping crews to maintain these spaces. Let's just have them do it differently for the same cost. Now we're not using gasoline, you know, we're not using pesticides and herbicides in the same volume. So now we can invest in people, right? So the cost doesn't go up. It's just differently apportioned.
But the
And
magic there is like you're investing in people instead of shit that you have to buy from, whatever industrial company. So not only are you spending the same amount of money, but you're actually providing more employment, it sounds
Yep.
like.
Yeah, and more money then stays in the community. You're saving a ton of money. While we will not say this is going to save you money on landscaping, right? In some respects, it may even cost you a little bit more, but the value add to the community, you now have food insecurities reduced, climate change. It's a climate change mitigation strategy. You're keeping soil in place so your sewer systems last longer. You're employing people. You know, the kind of hidden secret about the landscaping industry is that like a lot of people working in that industry are undocumented immigrants in this country, and they're not paid a living wage. So we're saying this is so cost efficient, and it's because we're not paying people what they need to live, right?
It's because it's always the hidden externalities. Oh, this is cheap means, oh, we're hiding where we're cutting the corners so you can't see it.
Yes, yeah. And this model of the productive urban landscape way of doing things allows you to, I would we argue that it allows you to do the most good for the least extra expense, right? Like if you were to or internalize all those externalities, I mean, it would probably double, triple the price of landscaping, right? And
Oh yeah.
we're not, what we're saying is, no, we're not going to internalize those externalities. We're going to let go of those externalities by doing this slightly differently. So you can spend that same budget, but now you're reducing budget in all these other buckets. Or better yet, those, you know, all the extra savings in the sewer system, how about you go put that towards updating your sewer system, which all these communities need to do, right?
Oh yeah.
And so our ultimate like argument is really financial. It's really a fiscal argument, is that oddly enough, the least efficient way to grow landscapes is the most cost effective. If and I think that's and kind of get back to Doomer Optimism. I think that's some of what's going on in the Doomer Optimist crowd, is that we're realizing that some of these old ways of doing things are only inefficient because we assume human labor is inefficiency. Like that's the assumption. But human
Oh
labor,
yeah.
in a Taylorist sense of like, I'm going to clock you and make sure you're optimizing a sledgehammer usage, right? No, that's horrible. That's making a person a machine. But agriculture, growing things, doing things as a community is not necessarily work, right? That is, it is a way of spending your days in which people's lives can be in alignment. There's a lot of people that would gladly work as a grower, right? And then you could have old people working as growers. You could have young people working as growers. It's now a safe career, so you can have 15-year-olds doing it instead of working at McDonald's, right? This is a whole way of being that is in line with capitalism, right? It's in line with capitalism. We're not saying people shouldn't be paid for their work. We're not saying you shouldn't make a profit. We're saying let's just start doing it slightly differently. It's for us, once in our Rootstown circle, it's become a very almost like, I don't know. It's so obvious that it's become a truth to us, right? That this is like, we can start small. Let's just start to shift some landscapers over to, closer to the fence.
Mhm.
We don't have to go full on food forestry on every public right of way, but we also like should not ever be planting grass again. Like it's almost no more cost to replace when you dig up to do the things that cities and counties are always doing. You dig up the dirt, replace it with a wildflower meadow. Like it's the same cost. Wildflower seeds are not expensive, and they're easier to maintain. You now only have to mow a couple times a year instead of mowing every 2 weeks,
Oh
right? I
yeah.
mean, it's just it's a
And
no-brainer. And
and
COVID
I
has
think
really helped us in that front.
in some contexts, grass is wonderful. Like you don't want to run around in a you don't want to play soccer in a wildflower field, right? So like
Exactly.
you still for public spaces, you're still going to want some grassed areas, but not every area. Like right now, it's like, oh, there's a 3 foot gap in this median. Let's put turf there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or let's just put cement there.
oh yeah,
Of
that
course.
too. Either one, neither one of those is a really great option, right?
Yeah.
So that's great. Can you tell me, like, I know you guys have a really great example project in a library in DeKalb, right? You have the DeKalb library
Uh,
that's like a good test bed.
yeah, yeah. So we were very fortunate. Jamie Rosenthal is the founder of Rootstown and my business partner. He established a good relationship with then mayor of Clarkston, Georgia, Ted Terry, and they helped catalyze some good projects in Clarkston. And then excuse me, when Ted became Commissioner Ted Terry of the county, this was one of the main initiatives he wanted to bring is how can we start adjusting the way that we do public landscaping to save money and make lives better. And so we started work with his office as well as Commissioner Marita Davis Johnson's office. So we kind of did two offices at the same time, and we just focused on the libraries. So we did 6 libraries in DeKalb County out of the 23, and we put test beds essentially around these gazebos at the libraries to kind of turn them into like an outdoor pavilion where people could sit, get out of the sun, and then also enjoy nature. And we planted some edible, or well, it's about 50-50 edible elements. I like to say everything in it is edible to something, but
There you
about
go.
50% is edible to people. Um, and the reaction has just been, I mean, just through the roof. Like we have people, it's like once people know about it, they go
This is
back
an
on
option.
Saturday. Yeah,
The world
absolutely.
can be like this. It's not
Yes.
just grass and like calorie pairs. Like
Yep.
this is a real thing.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's people that go back regularly and will get, some cherry tomatoes, it's somewhat self-regulating. Obviously these are small spaces. Like these are not certainly at the scale they're at, these are not food insecurity solutions. It's not a solution by itself. It needs to be paired with other things and it needs to be done at scale. As you know, like one little 1,000 square foot bed isn't going to, feed 20 families,
Yeah, but it can show people like this is not only possible, but this is actually even more feasible.
Yeah.
And you can transform the rest of your neighborhood can be like this as well.
Mhm. And this is where, I mean, this is the success we've had, and we're really very proud of it because, that first push, right, was some consulting, helping kind of like not sell the idea, but like explain the idea, right, to internal people like facilities management, which is the department who maintains the properties at the libraries, other commissioners, city officials, just kind of explaining what the heck we're doing here, right? And then we built the gardens as test beds to show it. It's a lot easier to sell a dream when you can show the dream than to just be talking about something in the
Yeah.
future.
Look, it's been done and it doesn't suck.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And and we also did a lot of community engagement, really kind of meeting with the community, hearing what they wanted to, making some missteps, learning how to engage with community better. Clarkston is an amazing test area for us because down here they call it one of the most diverse square miles in the country, right? I think there's over 80 nationalities are represented in this very small town. Um, and we've catalyzed, I think, 6 different projects in Clarkston now, and so we're very proud of the community engagement work that we've done there, and we have a lot of long ways to go, right? But the Clarkston Library is the kind of really become the centerpiece, right? We converted 30,000 square feet around the library. We now have using ARPA funds, the Rescue Act.
So 30,000 square feet. So we're talking 2/3 of an acre.
Yeah, pretty darn close. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what's been so amazing is that we have gotten an additional commitment from the county. They've set aside $250,000 of rescue plan funds to go to extending that through facilities management to the Clarkston Community Center. So now it's going to be a whole campus that's of 2 different types of government entities or semi-government entities working together to kind of create a unified campus, unified by the landscape, right? Which is going to be a totally new way of doing it. But beyond that, they passed the Fruitful Libraries resolution. The Board of Commissioners did here, so they are committing to $250,000 to do a transition plan to transition all 23 libraries in their system to this framework. It's just been astounding the level of response we've gotten. I mean, we started this work, it was a year ago in March, right? And we started this work, and it's been just been a tidal wave of interest in.
You guys have made all of that progress with government agencies inside a year.
A little over a year. So about 16 months. Yeah.
Okay. So a year and a half. You've done all of that inside a year and a half.
Yeah. I started with the
absolutely
company.
Insane.
I started with the company in earnest in January, February of 2021. By April, we'd broken ground on the first projects. And, I mean, I like to say from Earth Day to Earth Day, like this is what we with government. Yeah. And this is one of the central kind of, I don't know, lessons we've learned. And it's funny that so many of the kind of big, what so many in the Doomer Optimist circle call the bug people, the liberals who believe in
bugs and pods,
top down solutions, right? We have to make everyone do this, right? And policy is important. Don't get me wrong. Policy is very important. But we have believed since the very beginning that the actual scale at which these things should be deployed is at the city and county level. It's the optimal level. You have real budgets that you can do things with, but you also have real accountability.
And those people live there. The people making those choices are going to live there. That's like a huge thing. I think. Yeah,
exactly. And so, I gave up. I don't know, really around when we nominated Hillary and the whole Trump years. I really lost faith that the federal government was ever going to get their shit together in any kind of capacity that would be valuable. Now, the Reduction Act is cool and all, but it's really too little, too late. We needed bold, decisive action, and we needed it during Obama's presidency, really. And so I've been kind of, that was very hopeless for me for a while. But
Oh
this
yeah.
awareness that there is still enormous political will, enormous political power, and actual financial resources at the city and county level is really like, oh, this is the way. It's a lot, it's a fragmented, it's much more regional, but you can get a lot done at the city and county level of government.
See, that's magic. That's absolutely magic because what I do know is that if you live in a place and you see it every day and your neighbors are there, that the entire dynamic of government changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so like this is an absolutely like I think this is really threading the needle really well between giving up on government and then saying that, you know, the Supreme Court needs to mandate that every library has pear trees or you know, something along those lines. But the one of the biggest things that I notice about certain groups in startup world, tech world, et cetera, is that they constantly look at all of the problems in front of us as engineering problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that you never really talked about it being an engineering problem. Like you have the solutions that are going to like make a huge difference in your community, and that a lot of the work is being done with community engagement and whatnot. It's a sociological problem. It's an anthropological problem. It's a cultural problem, not an engineering problem. Um, Community engagement is really, really, really difficult. And you said you had a couple of stumbling points. Can you share some of the lessons? Because I think people are going to listen to this and be like, wait a second, they did that.
Yeah.
They did that in Atlanta. I want to do it. I want to do it here. How do I start? And you know, how do I avoid the big puddles that you guys stepped in on the way?
Yeah. You know, the first thing I would say that was really like eye-opening for us is we really started, well, this is more of a startup issue, is like you really do have to know what your product is. You have to know why you're doing something. Um, and and then listen to the customers, right? I mean, I know that the lean startup methodology has been a little bit kind of debunked, or now it's a little bit passe, but um, the audience is the one who's going to buy the product. So there is that, if you can get into that kind of dance early on where you're like, you try something and then they're like, nah, that's not it, and then you try something else and you kind of figure it out. For us, it's been very easy because in that respect, because the why has always been the same. The landscaping industry is a destructive force in this planet with huge budgets. We need to change that. Right now, how we've gone about it, we started very much as government consulting, right? And so our community engagement piece was more about educating the public about what the government was doing, right? And that's a big job. It's also one that, in urban environments, especially, you cannot ignore groups of people. Like that's one of the things that make government hard, especially at the city and county level in urban areas, specifically, especially large metropolitan areas, is you have a lot of diverse voices and you really can't afford to piss any of them off. Because in a vote that's decided by 40 votes, right? That could be the 40, when you didn't show up to the Jamaican American Association dinner, you
That
pissed
was
off
it.
40 votes, right? That was who you pissed off. And so there's a level of accountability at the local level that is really daunting, right? It's a very scary thing because it's one thing to, tweet an opinion or have your press agent talk about your opinion. It's quite another to have your neighbors coming to a meeting that you're leading and telling you you're an asshole, and for maybe vaguely personal reasons, or people saying like your idea is stupid and here is why, right? And you have only a couple options at that point. You either, learn to be flexible and talk and listen, truly listen to other people, not just defend yourself with words. Um, and acknowledge that everyone's voice is valid. And it only becomes less valid if they're squashing other people's voices, that's when it's sort of like, okay, your time, sit down. We need to hear from other people, right? And so I guess the long story short, like the first one is that diversity matters. Diversity of opinions matter. You have to meet people where they're at. which is hard. Like it's easier to pretend that's not real when you're trying to operate a large national or global scaled operation, right? When you're
Yeah.
Facebook, you're not a lot less concerned about making individual pockets happy. You're worried about the aggregate happiness, right?
Right.
Or aggregate performance. Working at the local level requires you to take everyone's viewpoint into consideration. And so it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Well,
It's a lot of hand to hand. I like to say it's hand to hand combat, right? Like you really have to like meet people where they're at, you know?
what were the objections that you were hearing? What were people's concerns? Because I hear this, and other than the joke I made about the fruit falling and attracting flies,
Yeah.
it sounds wonderful, but then again, I'm the choir, so preach, right?
Yeah. Well, no, the food thing comes up all the time, right? Which we have to, kind of point out that like we're not planting fruit trees, we're planting an ecosystem. And ecosystems necessarily even themselves out after a while, right? They sort themselves out. And it may take a few seasons to attract the right birds, but eventually you will, and that overage won't be so obvious. Also in urban areas, specifically to that question, in urban areas like I mean, there's such a monoculture that when you produce an oasis, it's like the cardinals all tell the other cardinals or something, and then you end up with like an overabundance of what you brought, and then that brings a predator, right? Who now is like, oh, great, the cardinal buffet,
But it
and
takes a couple of seasons for that
it does,
predator to figure it out, doesn't it?
it does, and that's why the concrete jungle model is so important for sort of saying as we scale or as we replicate this in other cities, we will either be working with whoever is the local concrete jungle, or we'll be working with concrete jungle to help them scale too, or we'll be simply seeding the organization we need in order to help us achieve the other end of that. But the other obvious question we get all the time is who's going to maintain this, right?
Yeah.
Um, and you might be surprised given our solutions, right? But that actually tripped us up a lot in the early days and the answer is obvious. Like now the answer is, well, who's maintaining it now? Right. Like,
We just change what they do and
yeah,
make it
exactly.
make it less shitty to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, that was really, in fact, that question and the number of times we stumbled on it was a central kind of like defining point when we realized when we figured out the answer to that question, we also figured out one of the core tenets of our solution, which is training and recertification or retraining and certification for landscapers. So the mow and blow landscapers can start to access this enormous emerging market that right now is left. I mean, here's some of the statistics on this. Like less than 3% of landscapers are ecological landscapers, right? So the reverse of that, 97% of the market are mow and blow landscapers. That's what they do, right? And yet close to something like 30 to 40% of American like landowners are open to some form of ecological landscaping. So what that means is there's just this enormous friction because there's more supply than there is demand. And the biggest problem with this supply demand issue, which again, this is kind of an engineering problem, like when you look at it that way, but what you pointed out is that the actual problem is that both buckets are too ideological. This is a political issue. People think of it as a political issue instead of the right thing to do or a better way of doing business. So our goal is to get, kind of bridge that gap, get the 3% of ecological landscapers to be a little less ideological and pedantic about it, right? To sort of kind of democratize what has been kind of permaculture is a little bit of a fiefdom, right? Like, or like an esoteric class of knowledge that only the true believers understand. And we're sort of democratizing that a little bit. At the same time, we're telling all these mow and blow landscapers who are like, we have this troll who continues to heckle us on Twitter, who's always like, I mean, he almost literally said, you're going to there'll always be lawns. You're going to have to pry my gas leaf blower out of my cold, dead hands, And we're just like, cool, dude, cool, bro. Like, well, 40, 50% of your guys on your side of the fence are eco-curious, like they're kind of like, I'm open to it if someone would make it easy for me. And what they need is education. They need access to the market. And so that's really where we've decided, that's where we realize that's what the market needs. It needs someone to start to lessen that friction and start to let supply meet and demand meet in the marketplace. And that alone will, I mean, can you think if we manage to like eliminate 30% of the 50 million acres of lawn and replace it with wildflower meadows or fruit trees? I mean, another kind of statistic, I think America grows something like orchards on like 10 million acres of land. And we have 50 million acres of lawn. So we could increase our fruit production by 5 times on our lawns, right? Now, of course, that's completely impractical. I don't think of that as like a kind of like William Wheelwright's like, thread about,
Oh yeah, yeah.
or if everyone grew chickens, right? Or raised chickens.
But it's a really really useful way of comparing numbers. You're like, look, even if 2% of people switch their lawn over to, or like, it would actually be noticeable.
Yep.
It would be a real thing. So a fraction of perfect is still absolutely absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
So are you creating your own certification for this, or are you? So tell us about that.
Yeah, we're creating it from scratch. There doesn't appear to be, there's tons of permaculture certificates and information about permaculture in a residential or
Mhm.
homesteading, or even a larger farming like operation. But there isn't as much about like commercial landscapers, right? Which make up the bulk of that 130 billion is commercial operations, not necessarily residential. And so, our thought is, well, we need to scale up education. That's what needs to scale up. Is more people need to be able to do the small things, like recognize what's a weed, for instance, and what's actually a beneficial plant, right? Um, and so we're kind of starting with those level 1, level 2, level 3 certification in 3 key areas: maintenance, install, and design. We've soft launched the level 1 maintenance certification with one of the contractors that maintain the libraries. And then we're rolling it out with Georgia Piedmont Technical College in September. It'll actually be an online course that people can take. You do I think it's a couple hours online, and then you show up for a practicum like at one of the productive urban landscapes at the libraries, to get some hands-on training. And it's all just around like, what is a productive urban landscape? Why don't we want to prune it into a ball every 2 weeks, right? Like it's such an elementary question, but it's a good question, right? Why is this bad? Because I think this looks better, right, than this what I think is an unkempt bush. And it's like, well, because you're like, it's like one is trimming your cat's claws every once in a while, and the other is every 2 weeks ripping its toes out, right? Like,
Yeah,
these are
yeah.
two completely different scenarios, right? And they don't know that because it looks great until it starts getting brown and everything around it dies, and then soon it's dead. And by then, it's not really their problem. They did what they were supposed to do. They put it into a ball like they were supposed to, and now they're just putting dried sticks into a ball, right? Um, and so we just need to like start to change little things, recognizing the little things they can change. And then from a business standpoint, we've launched the app, our Rootstown app, which you can get on Apple or Android. And that's sort of a way of like, we like to say it's like a garden club with like a side of climate action, right? So you're going to get practical tips for how to maintain your yard, the same that we're giving to growers and landscapers. And then you're also going to be given practical tips about how you can actually start to move your local officials, right? Actually start to make the policy changes that will make these types of changes legal. Um, and so we're really trying to like kind of just seed it. We get a lot of people that are interested and they want to do something, but they're in this position where we're told like, email your senator, right? Shout about it on social media, put a sign in your front yard, and none of these they're satisfying in the moment, but they don't actually move anything. Um, and also, I personally don't believe that climate action is going to come from the federal and international level. It's going to come from the ground up, and it's either going to come from the natural pressures of the ecological crises we find ourselves in, or it's going to come from what Doomer Optimism hints at is a whole lot of people across the political spectrum realizing the same damn thing at the same time, which is that we need to live smaller lives that are closer to the land, and filled with community and engagement among people, not filled with necessarily commercial endeavors at every step of the way. Man, that was a rant. Sorry.
No, no, that was beautiful because it is. I mean, that's the picture, right?
Yeah.
There's a bunch of people who are, and I count myself kind of among them, where I'm like, my response to this is I need more space so that I can plant more. And I love that your and Rootstown's response is like, no, we actually have plenty of space here, and we already have community built in. So let's use those two things that we already have and turn those into, instead of them being a net drain, turn them into like a massive, massive positive thing. And then the other thing that I love about it is that every time you read about the blue zones where, people live a long time, it has to do with community, and it has to do with, small groups of people often tending gardens. And just the fact that the way you guys are painting the future in Atlanta, and hopefully a lot of other places in the next couple of years, especially at the pace you're moving, there's going to be a lot more people who understand that, like, the incredible power of just growing some potatoes and some garlic. Like, it is one of the most underrated but really powerfully transformative things people can do is start a little garden. And a lot of people don't, because they're the only ones. Everybody else has got yards and pools and all of this. But if it starts to become a thing that happens in the water around, there's going to be a lot more people who will take a slight bit of interest, and then that'll be the catalyst that changes awareness. I know it happened for me, and it happened for almost everybody that we interact with in the Doomer Optimism adjacent circles. It's really, really powerful. We're coming up on an hour here. Where can people find out more about Rootstown?
Well, obviously our website, it's rootstownga.com. You also, if you search for Rootstown in the App Store or Google Play, you can find our app. That's a great way. It's totally free to sign up. And we're also Rootstown GA on all the social platforms. That's a great place to find us as well. Mostly Instagram. We focus mostly on Instagram, but which is ironic given the fact that I'm on Twitter personally. That's almost my exclusive platform. But the company spends more time on Instagram.
That's one of pictures, 1,000 words, etc. And that's powerful. Dude, thanks for sharing a beautiful vision of what suburbs. We started off talking about how suburbs suck and suck the soul out, and then the rest of the time was, hey, we can take this kind of broken infrastructure and turn it into something really wonderful and regenerative and restorative for the humans.
Yeah.
So I think that's beautiful, and I really, really love what you guys are doing. So if anybody's interested, please go check this out, and find Trace on Twitter. He's Dog Eat Crow, right?
Yes.
At Dog Eat Crow.
Yeah.
Trace, good to catch up with you, man.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dave.
Of course, brother.